Have you ever wondered how poetry for children developed and who are the prominent poem makers or poets who contributed much for this children's literature genre? What is poetry? It's a literary work in which a special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Poems collectively or as a genre of literature. Poetry development has been irregular, but in the order of appearance, most of the writers of the present inherited from the past, and each in his own way tried to sing the songs of children in key with the spirit of the child and the spirit of times. Poetry for children has paralleled closely the development of prose literature. At first, there's only folk rhymes, singing games, ballads, and other traditional verse intended for adults, but which were later relegated to children. Early poetry for children has parallel development with prose, like for example, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travel, and Pilgrim's Progress. Let's see how the younger children started to enjoy poetry with the help of important few poem makers. Here they are. Isaac Watts was an English Christian minister, hymn writer, theologian, and logician. He was a prolific and popular hymn writer and is credited with some 750 hymns. He is recognized as the godfather of English hymnody. Many of his hymns remain in use today and have been translated into numerous languages. Watts was born in Southampton, Hampshire, England in 1674 and was brought up in the home of a committed religious nonconformist. His father, also Isaac Watts, had been incarcerated twice for his views. Watts had a classical education at King Edward VI School, Southampton, learning Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Watts displayed a propensity for rhyme from an early age. He was once asked why he had his eyes open during prayers, to which he responded, "A little mouse for want of stayers ran out a rope to say its prayers." He received corporal punishment for this, to which he cried, "Oh Father, Father, pity take, and I will no more verses make." William Blake. He was an English poet, painter, and printmaker. Largely unrecognized during his lifetime, Blake is now considered a seminal figure in the history of the poetry and visual arts of the Romantic Age. What he called his prophetic works were said by 20th century critic Northrop Fryer to form what is in proportion to its merits the least read body of poetry in the English language. His visual artistry led 21st century critic Jonathan Jones to proclaim him far and away the greatest artist Britain has ever produced. In 2002, Blake was placed at number 38 in the BBC's poll of the 100 greatest Britons. While he lived in London his entire life, except for 3 years spent in Felpham, he produced a diverse and symbolically rich oeuvre, which embraced the imagination as the body of God, or human existence itself. Although Blake was considered mad by contemporaries for his idiosyncratic views, he is held in high regard by later critics for his expressiveness and creativity, and for the philosophical and mystical undercurrents within his work. His paintings and poetry have been characterized as part of the Romantic movement and as pre-Romantic. A committed Christian who was hostile to the Church of England, indeed to almost all forms of organized religion. Blake was influenced by the ideals and ambitions of the French and American revolutions. Though later he rejected many of these political beliefs, he maintained an amiable relationship with the political activist Thomas Paine. He was also influenced by thinkers such as Emanuel Swedenborg. Despite these known influences, the singularity of Blake's work makes him difficult to classify. The 19th century scholar William Michael Rossetti characterized him as a glorious luminary and a man not forestalled by predecessors, nor to be classed with contemporaries, nor to be replaced by known or readily surmissible successors. Anne Taylor, later Mrs. Joseph Gilbert, was an English poet and children's author. She is best known as the sister and collaborator of Jane Taylor. Jane Taylor was an English poet and novelist. She wrote the words for the song Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in 1806 at age 23. The Taylor sisters were part of an extensive literary family. The Taylor sisters, though adequately moral, struck a new note of sweetness, of humor, at any rate of a non-priggishness. Their Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, included in Rhymes for the Nursery in 1806, has not only been memorized but actually liked by many generations of small children. Jane wrote the words to the song Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which is widely known, but it is generally forgotten who wrote it. The sisters, Jane and Anne Taylor, in their authorship of various works have often been confused, in part because their early ones were published together. Anne Taylor's son, Josiah Gilbert, wrote in her biography, two little poems, My Mother and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, are perhaps more frequently quoted than any. The first, A Lyric of Life, was by Anne, the second, Of Nature, by Jane, and they illustrate this difference between the sisters. Edward Lear, my favorite. Edward Lear was an English artist, illustrator, musician, author, and poet. Now known mostly for his literary nonsense and poetry and prose, and especially his limericks, a form he popularized. His principal areas of work as an artist were threefold: as a draftsman employed to illustrate birds and animals, making colored drawings during his journeys, which he reworked later, sometimes as plates for his travel books, and as a minor illustrator of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poems. Mention Edward Lear and most people with a love of poetry will think of limericks and nonsense prose that bring a smile to the lips. Born in 1812 near London, Lear was the youngest of 21 children and was brought up by his sister Anne, who acted as his mother for most of their lives. He was not the healthiest of individuals, suffering from epilepsy and asthma, the former causing him much embarrassment throughout his life. It also led Lear to suffer from periodic bouts of depression. Early on, he discovered a gift for drawing and was employed by the Zoological Society, and later also produced a number of powerful landscapes on his numerous visits to Egypt and India. But it was for his writing that Edward Lear is best known. He helped to make limericks popular with the general public when he produced his illustrated collection, A Book of Nonsense, in 1846. Most children will know the poem The Owl and the Pussycat, as it has remained a staple of bedtime reading for more than a century and a half. Same thing with me. I love this
narrative poem.
Christina Georgina Rossetti. She was an English poet who wrote various romantic, devotional, and children's poems. Goblin Market and Remember remain famous. She wrote the words of two Christmas carols well known in the UK, In the Blake Midwinter, later set by Gustav Holst and by Harold Darke, and Love Came Down at Christmas, set by Harold Darke and by other composers. Rossetti's most famous collection, Goblin Market and Other Poems, appeared in 1862 when she was 31. It received widespread critical praise, establishing her as the foremost female poet of the time. Hopkins, Swinburne, and Tennyson lauded her, and with the death of Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1861, she was hailed as her natural successor. Celia Thaxter. She was an American writer of poetry and stories. For most of her life, she lived with her father on the Isles of Shoals at his Appledore Hotel. How she grew up to become a writer is detailed in her early autobiography published by St. Nicholas, and her book entitled Among the Isles of Shoals. Thaxter became one of America's favorite authors in the late 19th century. Among her best-known poems are the Burgomastergal, Landlocked, Milking, The Great White Owl, The Kingfisher,
and the Sandpiper.
Thaxter's first published poem was written during this time on the mainland. That poem, Landlocked, was first published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861 and earned her $10. In 1879, Thaxter suddenly became known upon the literary horizon with a collection of poems entitled Driftwood. And considering that they came from a group of islands away from the mainland far enough to prevent frequent communication, the debuting work was received with almost as much surprise as pleasure. All those stray poems of the ocean had been published, signed with the name of Celia Thaxter. Still, it was difficult for the critical reviewer of Boston to realize that the bearer of this name was actually a long-time resident, if not exactly a native of those isles lying off the coast of New Hampshire. Her poetry appeared in the Atlantic Century, Harper's Independent, New England Magazine, and Scribner's, while her writing for juvenile audiences appeared in Our Young Folks and St. Nicholas. Robert Louis Stevenson. He was a Scottish novelist, poet, and travel writer, most noted for Treasure Island, Kidnapped, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, and A Child's Garden of Verses. Born and educated in Edinburgh, Robert suffered from serious bronchial trouble for much of his life, but continued to write prolifically and travel widely in defiance of his poor health. As a young man, he mixed in London literary circles, receiving encouragement from Andrew Lang, Edmund Gussie, Leslie Stephen, and W.E. Henley, the last of whom may have provided the model for Long John Silver in Treasure Island. In 1890, he settled in Samoa, where he died in 1894. A celebrity in his lifetime, Stevenson's critical reputation has fluctuated since his death. Though today his works are held in general acclaim, he is currently ranked as the 26th most translated author in the world. Laura Elizabeth Richards. She was a prolific American writer who was responsible for some 90 books during her lifetime. She She's best known for her children's stories and poetry, with possibly her most famous piece of work being a short piece of poetic nonsense called Ile Telephony. Her legacy? A pre-kindergarten to 5th grade elementary school in Gardiner, Maine, bears her name. Her children's book, Tira Lira, won the Lewis Carroll Shelf Award in 1959. Her home in Gardiner, the Laura Richards House, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And here are some of 90 books she wrote. Baby's Rhyme Book, 1878, Babyhood Rhymes and Stories, Pictures and Silhouettes for Our Little Ones in 1878. Baby's Storybook in 1879, Trap 1880, Our Baby's Favorite 1881, Sketches and Scraps 1881, Five Mice and a Mouse, The Little Tyrant 1880, Baby Ways 1881, and a lot more. It would take a long time for us to read the names of those books. Rose Amy Fyleman. She was an English writer and poet noted for works in the fairy folk for children. Her poem There Are Fairies at the Bottom of Our Garden was set to music by English composer Lyman. Her publications include more than 60 volumes of fiction, poetry, and plays. Fyleman was born in 1877 in Nottingham, England. She attended University College in Nottingham, then undertook training for a career as an opera singer. Fyleman failed to find work in opera, but she nonetheless managed to obtain employment as a singer. In addition, she conducted singing lessons and supplied poems to a periodical intended for women. Fyleman eventually began working as a school teacher. In this capacity, however, she found herself unable to readily supply her students with appropriate poems. She therefore began to generate her own poetry for use in her classroom. At the encouragement of a fellow teacher, Fyleman sent her poetry to Punch, which accepted her work for publication. In 1918, she published her first book, The Sunny Book, and in the last years of the decade, she produced 2 more volumes, Fairies and Chimneys and The Fairy Green. During the 1920s, Rose published further volumes of verse and fiction set in a fairyland free of gloom and danger. In her writings, as Donald R. Hettinga observed in Dictionary of Literary Biography, Fyleman avoided the darkness and the evil that many of the Celtic and Germanic fairy stories contain. He added, her fairy world is a world in which fairies are visible to children, but not to most adults, and in which the fairies seemingly exist for the delight of children. Angie Hay, meanwhile, wrote in the St. James Guide to Children's Writers that Fyleman's fairies are wonderful and understandable. Alan Alexander Milne. He was an English author, best known for his books about the teddy bear, Winnie the Pooh, and for various poems. Milne was a noted writer, primarily as a playwright, before the huge success of Pooh overshadowed all his previous work. Milne served in both World Wars, joining the British Army in World War I, and as captain of the British Home Guard in World War II. He is the father of bookseller Christopher Robin Milne, upon whom the character Christopher Robin is based. Rachel Lyman Field. She was an American novelist, poet, and children's fiction writer. She is best known for the Newbery Award-winning Hitty, Her First 100 Years. Field also won a National Book Award, Newbery Honor Award, and 2 of her books are on the Lewis Carroll Shelf Award list. Hitty, Her First 100 Years, received the Newbery Award in 1930 for the year's most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. The 1944 posthumous Prayer for a Child, with a story by Field and illustrations by Elizabeth Orton Jones, won the Caldecott Medal, recognizing the year's most distinguished picture book for children published in the United States. Hitty and Prayer for a Child were both named to the Lewis Carroll Shelf Award, list of books deemed to belong on the same bookshelf with Carroll's Alice. Prayer for a Child was one of the 17 inaugural selections in 1958, which were originally published in 1893 to 1957. Hitty was added in 1961. Time Out of Mind won one of the inaugural National Book Awards as the most distinguished novel of 1935, voted by the American Booksellers Association. Dorothy Aldis. Dorothy Keeley was born in Chicago to James Keeley, managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, and Gertrude Keeley. Like her mother, who reported for the Sunday Tribune, Aldis began working for the paper, writing columns on decorating, pets, and personals. On June 15, 1922, she married Graham Aldis. The couple lived in Chicago and had 4 children. Her first publications were books of poetry for children. In 1929, she began writing children's fiction. Unable to find time to write at home with her growing family, Aldis often took her typewriter to a local park to work. In this way, she wrote 7 novels and 3 books of poetry during the 1930s. Several of her best-known poems were published in these early years, such as Snow, Little, and Hiding. Dorothy also wrote short stories and poetry for Ladies' Home Journal, Harper's, and The New Yorker, among others. Aldis published 29 books, including a Beatrix Potter biography titled Nothing is Impossible. According to Joyce Kincaid in American Writers for Children, Aldis was recognized as a major contributor to children's literature. After her death in 1966, Elementary English called her the Poet Laureate of Young Children. She was the recipient of the Children's Reading Roundtable Award of Chicago. This time, let us have some modern poets for children.
Let's begin with
Myra Kahn Livingston.
Livingston.
A newcomer to the scene of children's poetry, has freshness and charm in her poems. Her book, Whispers and Other Poems, is filled with laughter, curiosity, gaiety, and tenderness. Her second book, Wide Awake, has many imaginative and gay poems. This time, let us have Mary Ann Hoverman, who founded and performed with both the Pocket People, a children's theater group, and Women's Voice, a group giving dramatized poetry readings. But ever since her first book was published in 1957, her primary occupation has been writing for children. Hoverman is the author of roughly 50 books, all but one of which is in verse. Her first book of poems, All My Shoes Come in Twos, was illustrated by her husband. Some of her best-known titles are A House is a House for Me, The 7 Silly Eaters, and The Llama Who Had No Pajama, a collection of 100 of her favorite poems. Her poems have been widely anthologized, and her books have been translated into several languages. Another great poet in our list is John Anthony Sharday. He was an American poet, translator, and etymologist. While primarily known as a poet, he also translated Dante's Divine Comedy. He wrote several volumes of children's poetry. He has written an engaging book of verse for young children entitled The Reason for the Pelican. He uses imaginary animals with fantastic names such as the Sagansak or the Bugle-billed Bazoo. Some of his best poems are more serious, such as the simple Rain Sizes and the delightful How to Tell the Top of a Hill. Another task given to me for reporting is to discuss something about nursery rhymes.